Hello and welcome everyone to today's Linnean Society lunchtime lecture. And for those of you who are new to the Linnean Society, it is the world's oldest active society devoted to natural history and takes its name from the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, whose botanical, zoological and library collections have been in its care since 1829. Designated as a collection of outstanding national importance by the Arts Council back in 2014, the holdings of the Society provide an unsurpassed resource for the study of natural history. Access to the collections is available through the brilliantly hardworking collections team, who can be contacted at library@linnean.org if you need to. And on the website, more details about the collections, links to digitized content, and a whole host of blogs, essays, podcasts, news, but also how to become a member or a fellow can also be accessed there. All of this content, outreach, connection, and engagement revolves around the Society's vision of a world where nature is understood, valued, and protected. And to do this, it aims to inform, involve, and inspire people about nature and its significance through its collections, publications, and events such as these lunchtime lecture series. So without further ado, I have the absolute pleasure today to introduce you to today's speaker, who is Erica Fischer, a PhD student with the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine in the Department of History at King's College London. Formerly at the Department of Entomology at Michigan State University, where they were involved with the A.J. Cook arthropod research collection, which is a collection that was started by Professor Albert J. Cook in 1867 and was later named in his honour, and it now houses close to 1.5 million specimens, so not an inconsiderable collection. Erica's current research combines statistical methods for studying digitized biodiversity collections with archival sources, to better understand the circumstances in which specimens were being collected and the people who were collecting them. Their lecture today is on amateur lepidopterists and their involvement in the growing natural history collections in the US and the UK over the past 200 years. And as Padma said, there will be time for questions at the end once Erica has finished their talk. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them into the question and answer box, and hopefully we'll get through all of them at the end. So for now, over to Erica.
Thank you. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you as well to the Linnean Society for their invitation for me to rant about the ways that I've been working to understand museum collections and their donors, in particular amateur and butterfly moth collectors. So just to sort of get everyone on the same page to start, I'm going to go through sort of the anatomy of an insect specimen. Apologies to anyone for whom this is a refresher or sort of really old news. I've been working with historians for the last couple of years, and I've been reminded on multiple occasions that not everyone is familiar with how insect specimens are labeled. So this is an orange sulfur. I've got pictures of this specimen pretty much just to show you what an insect looks like with labels on it. So the label closest to the insect has information like locality data, who collected it, when it was collected. The second label is usually an identification label, so it'll have that it's a Lepidoptera specimen, the family name and the species, along with the name of whoever determined what species it is, so whoever identified the specimen. And then the other labels on a specimen can include lots of things. On this specimen, the third label is a cataloging number. But sometimes you end up with wild specimens like this one. So this particular underwing moth has its identification label like normal. It also has 3 sort of normal identification labels in addition to the sort of information about where it was collected and when. But it also has 2 much longer identification labels that sort of go through a debate between 2 lepidopterists about what species it actually belongs to. So one of them thinks that it's part of a species complex. The other thinks that it's an aberrant form of a completely different species. But I love this particular specimen because of all these labels, because it's very fun to see things like 2 entomologists arguing on labels. This one in particular is from the A.J. Cook Arthropod Research Collection at Michigan State. Let's see. All right. Moving on. So this talk is broadly speaking about 2 sort of separate but similar projects, both of which used label data from specimens like the ones I've just shown you. I'm first going to go through sort of the broad strokes of both studies, so where I've gotten the data I've used, the kinds of additional information and materials that make studying amateur Lepidopterists possible, and some basic information about the methods that I've used. From there, I'll explain sort of the first project, which looked at amateur and professional collectors of Lepidoptera specimens in the US from 1800 to 2018. So this will include things like how many specimens that are now housed in institutions were collected per year, the relative contributions of amateur and professional collectors over time, and the influence that a single amateur collector can have on an institutional collection. Next, I'll give you an idea of what I'm working on now using labeled data from London's Natural History Museum. This second study in a lot of ways builds on the methods and the ideas that were developed over the course of the US study, but incorporates a bit more nuance and is also very much a sort of deep dive into the collection of a single institution. This also sort of includes ways that I'm working on combining labeled data and quantitative methods with archival research to better understand collections in the historical contexts that their collectors were operating in. I'm also going to try and give you some brief insight into why all this is sort of important beyond the fact that I think it's cool. So, quick warning for you. I am almost certainly over the course of this talk going to just sort of end up referring to butterflies and moths as leps. So the order of insects that butterflies and moths belong to is the Lepidoptera. I affectionately refer to them as leps because saying Lepidoptera over and over again sort of gets tiring. So just to be clear, sort of everything here is about butterflies and moths, which are lepidopterans, aka leps. Now, you may ask me why leps, Erica? And part of that is definitely just that I really like butterflies and moths. They're the group that really kind of got me interested in entomology to start with. And I'm super happy that I've gotten to stick with them as a study group. They're also a pretty good choice for some historical reasons. So insects were collected and preserved in some of the earliest cabinets of curiosity, as insects, perhaps especially butterflies and moths, are often visually interesting, regardless of how well the collector understands the science and the species they've acquired. Insects are also generally pretty small, so they can be collected in far greater numbers than things like mammals or just sort of vertebrates in general. Butterflies and moths are especially charismatic insects, and many species are relatively easy to identify, making them sort of an ideal group for studying the efforts of collectors, a group which includes both experts and non-experts in the field of entomology. I also work with leps because there's a lot of data available online. So while labeled data for insects in general are increasingly available via the internet, the US study in particular made use of data that was generated through funding that was specifically for digitizing lep specimens. So while I work with labeled data, I'm not necessarily looking directly at the specimens themselves. I'm generally downloading large tables of labeled data from online repositories. Mostly that involves the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, and the Symbiotic Collections of Arthropods Network, or SCAN. Now, this data is unsurprisingly imperfect. While I always end up with very large spreadsheets that Excel doesn't even want to think about opening, let alone actually open, they're also always limited in a few ways. First is funding. So not all institutions have funding to digitize all of their specimens and their specimen labels, which means that sort of data in these repositories are always going to be biased, perhaps especially in geographic terms, depending on who has funding and where. They're also limited by the activity of specimen collectors. So the spatial and temporal coverage is always going to be determined by who was collecting, where they were collecting, when they were collecting, and how many of them were collecting at any given year period. There's also taxonomic biases. So that project that underlies a lot of the US data prioritized moths. So it's not necessarily sort of representative of the distribution of specimens within all of the participating institutions. All of my analyses are done in R, mostly using the base statistics package. All of the graphs in these slides are made using ggplot2. Additional packages that I used for cleaning data and making figures are dplyr and TTR, or technical treating rules. I identified or classified collectors as amateur or professional using repeated Google searches of names taken from the label data, and also terms like entomologist or Lepidoptera. For US collectors, a lot of times these sorts of searches would pull up back issues of publications like the journal or the newsletter of the Lepidopterist Society, or issues of publications from local societies, such as the Michigan Entomological Society. For the NHM data, I was often finding collectors in the Entomologist's Record and Journal of Variation, which is now published by the Amateur Entomologist Society. So this first project that I did looked at butterfly and moth specimen data, and was my MS research project at Michigan State, where I worked with Anthony Cognato. It was really sort of my first stab at how we can use specimens in institutional collections to better understand the role that amateurs have in building these collections. So the US study came out of an overarching project known as the Lepidoptera of North American Network, or LEPNet, the goal for which was the digitization of at least 1.7 million North American LEP specimens housed in 27 institutions. All of the data from this project is available via scan. In total, after cleaning the data, the analyses I conducted used 1,031,401 specimens, which were collected across the country from 1800 to 2018. The majority of the cleaning I did was really to make sure that everything was collected in the 50 states. So I removed anything that was collected in the US territory, made sure that it actually had a date, and also made sure that everything was correctly identified as a Lepidopteran group. There were some families that sort of snuck in there that weren't Leps. When looking at the collectors, I used a dichotomy of amateur and professional to categorize them. So it was almost entirely based on income. So the amateurs would be people who donated specimens, but were never or not employed as an entomologist at like a university or a research institution, while professionals, on the other hand, were paid to do some sort of entomological work. In this case, sort of the term amateur has been left very broad on purpose, and is genuinely just defined in terms of income. It says absolutely nothing about their skill or their interest levels. So the black line on this first graph shows the number of collection events annually between 1800 and 2018. Collecting sort of really takes off for World War II, and it dies a death by 2010. The highest annual count of 23,319 specimens for the US was in 1996, and collecting activity sort of crashes after that. The late 1990s is also when professional collecting overtakes amateurs, as we will see in the next slide. It's worth noting that there are more moths than butterflies in this data set, but this is at least partially because, again, LEPNet prioritized moths. The blue line is a decadal moving average, which makes sort of trends a bit easier to see and interpret. And then the gray lines are one standard deviation from the mean, also on a rolling decadal basis. So while collecting activity was on the rise in the mid-20th century, it plateaus in the 1970s and really decreases from the late 1990s and into the 2000s. At least part of that big dip in the 2000s is sort of backlog at collections. Again, this is all sort of, it all answers to funding. So whether or not an institution had funding to curate these things before sort of really getting started on digitization has an influence on the data that I have. All of these sort of changes in collecting over time, especially the changes that occurred over the course of the 20th century, may be due to changes and developments in the field of sort of biology more generally, as far as sort of who's studying what in the academic world, and also due to levels of education achieved in the field, as influenced by funding structures or school curricula. One thing we suggested is that maybe the GI Bill contributed to the accessibility of natural history training after World War II, which would then be reflected in that rapid growth that we see after 1950. Going back to just specimens, I'm of the opinion that this is all sort of interesting on its own because it demonstrates sort of big trends over time as far as Lepidoptera collecting goes, and levels of popular interest in the States. But it doesn't really tell us anything about the specimen collectors themselves. What does this data tell us about collectors would be the next question, right? So using this dichotomy of amateur and professional, I set out to figure out sort of how many people were doing what and when. I found that more than 50% of digitized Lepidoptera specimens had been collected and donated by an amateur collector. So in this figure, the dark blue line shows the annual counts for amateur collectors, while the light blue line shows the same for professionals. and professionals start to out-collect amateur lepidopterists in sort of the late 1990s. But for a lot of the period from 1925 to 2018, amateurs were out-collecting professionals. The periods that are bounded here by an orange box are where there's a particularly significant statistical difference between the counts of amateur and professional collectors. Having undertaken this research at Michigan State, it'd be truly a shame to not use a local example to demonstrate the influence that even a single amateur lepidopterist can have on an institutional collection. So my personal favorite for various reasons is Mo Nielsen, who was a founding member of the Michigan Entomological Society and contributed over 15,000 butterfly and moth specimens to the university's arthropod research collection. He was particularly interested in genera that are now part of the Eurybids, and I spent the better part of sort of 2 summers just databasing his collection of underwing moths. He was an avid collector, such an avid collector that for some species of lep, I can actually graph Mo's annual counts against the sum total of everyone else who was working in the state of Michigan. So on this slide, there's a graph showing his annual specimen counts for Eurybids, since he really loved that group and collected a lot of them, versus sort of everyone else. So the blue line is Mo, the red line is not Mo. And it doesn't necessarily look sort of impressive at first glance, right? Because the red line is doing quite a lot. However, there are 268 collectors who contributed to that red line. So I'm of the opinion that it's pretty impressive that Mo's specimen count is not just sort of hanging out along the x-axis, and is also higher than sort of the sum total of everyone else in some years. Mo also volunteered in the LEP collection and the arthropod research collection for many years, and there are lots and lots of specimens in there that weren't necessarily collected by him, but that have an identification label that he signed off on, so to speak. So ultimately, my point is really that it's hard to overstate the influence that Mo, a single collector, had on both sort of the LEP collection at Michigan State and on Lepidoptera collecting more widely in Michigan. So there are plenty of people who would point to Mo's enthusiasm as being sort of the inspiration behind their own interest in moths and butterflies. So while so much of what I do really looks at collectors as groups, I think it's really important to highlight the efforts and contributions that one man, who was not a professional entomologist, made to an institutional collection. So to quickly summarize the US study, specimens have not been consistently collected over time, which is unsurprising. There are probably lots of reasons for this, but they may include things like changing amounts of free time available to people who are interested in collecting butterflies and moths, the amount of education that people were receiving on average in the field of natural history, or even the availability of natural history like classes in universities, especially entomology. But really sort of the biggest takeaway is that over half of the digitized US LEP specimens in SCAN were collected by an amateur collector. Basically, we wouldn't have all of this data available now without the efforts of past amateurs. And even a single really dedicated collector can have a massive influence on an institution's collection. So moving on, I'm currently working on a project somewhat similar to the US study using LEP specimens from the UK. For the time being, I've just been looking at data from the NHM in London. So because this is a sort of a deep dive into just a portion of a single institutional collection, I'm going to sort of give you a brief historical background as far as its growth as a whole. So according to Norman Riley, former keeper of what was then the British Museum open bracket natural history close bracket Lepidoptera collection, in 1904, just the Lepidoptera portion of the museum's collection numbered 355,767 specimens. By 1963, the department had grown to a total of 7,119,245 butterfly and moth specimens. So on average, the butterfly and moth collection grew by approximately 115,000 specimens per year. This is all butterflies and moths, so it's regardless of country of origin. So it's not just the UK data, while my study is very much just the British specimens. So nothing was collected abroad and included in this study, basically. So using GBIF, I downloaded the specimen label data for all of the butterfly and moth specimens housed in the NHM that were collected in the UK. So this was a total of 365,569 specimen records. The earliest was collected in 1792, and the most recent is from this year, 2022. So this graph shows the number of LEPs in the NHM caught annually But again, this is limited to just the approximately 370,000 specimens caught in the British Isles. As you can see, collecting sort of plummeted after the 1950s. Because what I'm really sort of interested in this current project is the period when amateur Lepidopterists were likely to be the most active, I'm focusing on sort of the period from 1881, which is when the museum moved to South Kensington, to the mid-1950s. And that period is denoted by this lovely orange box. I am on some level operating under the assumption that more collecting activity sort of generally is correlated with amateur activity. So for the collector bit of this project, because I'm now in a history department, I decided I should probably do something a bit more nuanced than just amateur and professional. Because those sort of, when you use a dichotomy, you're flattening what are ultimately pretty diverse groups of people, and you're eliminating a good amount of information about their lives as entomologists, be they paid or unpaid. So one of my sort of broad goals was to use more terms to define the collectors whose data I have. So I ended up going with 4 categories of collector, and I used sort of the same method I used before for identifying individual collectors, which is to say I did a lot of Googling of names with Lepidoptera or entomologist attached. I use the term amateur here to mean sort of a true amateur, if you will. So this is someone who probably didn't publish in entomological magazines, weren't necessarily participating in entomological or natural history societies, and sort of weren't really contributing to entomology outside of their specimens, which admittedly is very important, but I needed some sort of way to define these collectors. Unpaid collectors who were sort of more sophisticated isn't the right word, but sophisticated. I called amateur experts. So these were people who went sort of further and investigated the natural history of the species they collected, and also were generally more active in publishing in the literature, or they contributed their time to an institutional collection but weren't paid for that. I also decided to separate out specimen dealers, which is a group that's sort of pretty self-explanatory. This includes taxidermists, people who had butterfly farms where they were rearing and selling butterfly and moth specimens, and also naturalist suppliers, so like the people of Watkins and Doncaster. I'm using academic professionals here to describe entomologists who were paid by a research or educational establishment. Again, this is sort of a pretty wide range of positions and interests, but it's also not the majority of collectors. Obviously, these terms are still sort of a bit reductive, and some collectors are really sort of in the middle of 2, or they bounced between multiple terms over the course of their lives. But I sort of did my best in trying to look at each individual collector holistically to try and make a thoughtful decision as to how I should classify them. I mean, I think this is always going to be a little bit subjective. I still had to make decisions about how I was defining these types of collector. But unfortunately, such decisions have to be made if I want to be able to crunch numbers and make graphs. So these graphs show the number of specimens collected by the different collector types that I've just defined for you between 1881 and 1955. They've been graphed sort of separately for the sake of our collective eyes. When you shove them all onto a single graph, it becomes completely unreadable. So amateurs are shown here in green, amateur experts are shown in sort of turquoise, dealers are in purple, and professionals are in red. The peak year for amateur collectors in terms of the number of specimens they collected was in 1922, and they collected 2,124 specimens in this year. Overall, they contributed 46,611 specimens to the NHM between 1881 and 1955. 366 of them only donated a single specimen, which I thought was interesting. The peak year for amateur experts was 1925. So amateurs and amateur experts were sort of at their most active at the same time, though the amateurs sort of collected more specimens in this period and overall. Amateur experts contributed 44,157 specimens. On average, amateur experts donated approximately 99 specimens each. This is more than double the average of the amateurs, which was 48 specimens donated per collector. Activity by specimen dealers is relatively consistent, and it averages sort of approximately 126 specimens per year. And they contributed a total of 9,289 specimens. A notable outlier in this group is a butterfly farmer named Leonard Woods Newman, who himself donated 4,784 specimens, which is a little bit over half of the total number of specimens that I have listed under specimen dealers. Specimens collected by professionals reached their peak in 1948 before beginning to decline by the time 1955 rolls around. In total, academic professionals collected 22,681 specimens in this period. And differences in the annual specimen counts for the 4 different types of collector are statistically significant, with one exception. There's not a statistically significant difference between the amateurs and the amateur experts. Sticking with the same sort of color scheme, this is a plot of decadal moving averages for each of the different types of collector. Again, if I were to just sort of slap all the lines from the previous slide onto a single graph, it would be truly horrific to look at. Because this is decadal moving averages, sort of the peaks and whatnot are in slightly different places. But looking at these averages tends to make, it tends to smooth out some peaks and means that the broader trends are a bit easier to look at. So I think the line for amateurs is probably the most confusing. Again, the amateurs are in green because it sort of conflicts with most of the amateur graph from the previous slide. This makes it look like their peak is in the 1950s, not the 1920s. And this is a function of the rolling decadal average thing. The years near 1920 didn't have as high a specimen count, so sort of the average was then dropped down. I think probably the most interesting feature of this line is the way that amateurs and amateur experts sort of echo each other in some places. Something I'm currently sort of working on is a way to evaluate the role that corresponding with the staff of the NHM had on a collector's work. So did corresponding with the staff mean that someone collected more? Did the staff put a lot of effort into recruiting amateur experts as information or specimen gatherers? So basically, I've spent a ton of time combing through the correspondence archives at the NHM, and thankfully the archive staff are okay with that. So now you may be asking me, why does this matter? And I think there's sort of a few reasons for this. For one thing, growing recognition of biases in natural history collections means that it's probably important for us to understand sort of the ultimate causes of these biases. And sort of on some level, things boil down to the influence of collectors themselves because they were making decisions about where and when to collect and what they were collecting. So while some were certainly sort of systematic or survey type work, that's not necessarily true of everyone. In addition, declines in amateur collecting activity have implications for the future availability of data for scientific research. So while observational data can be useful for some studies, it can't totally replace specimens. Things like genetic information don't come from photos, unfortunately. From a historical standpoint, much of the existing literature about amateur and professional entomologists focused on published material, so articles and whatnot that were published in entomological journals or newsletters. Part of my sort of overarching goal with this project is to show how digitized label data could be used in historical research. And it's of course being sort of married with archival research. But at the moment, I'm really sort of working on the numbersy bits. I think masses of specimen information have a lot to tell us about the history of collecting, and I think LEPs are sort of a good place to start developing these ideas. So here at the end, I get to give some quick shout outs. So many thanks to the co-authors for the US Collector paper, Neil Cobb, Akito Kawahara, Jennifer Zaspel, and in particular, my former PI, Anthony Cognato. Even more thanks really belongs to the people who are digitizing these specimens or who did the collecting to begin with. Without them, we wouldn't have these records to do stuff with. The LEPnet databasing project was funded by the National Science Foundation. Additional databasing at Michigan State was funded by the Mark and Kathleen Schreiber Scholar Award in Butterfly Biology and Conservation. Label data for specimens in the NHM were accessed and downloaded from GBIF. I'm currently supported by the Hans Rausing Scholarship in the History of Science, and shout out to my current supervisors who are very much historians and sort of looking on in horror as I send them stats. Now, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have, and I can scroll back to any figures that you may want me to go back to, or I can repeat something if I move too fast. But I, given our technical glitch, I was trying to sort of keep us on some sort of schedule.
Thanks. Andrea, would you mind putting your video back on?
Is my video off?
No, yours is on. I meant
Okay.
Andrea's.
Okay.
I
Like, no, don't tell me I did this whole thing with my video off.
no. Both of you are on here.
I'm just messing up and creating havoc, but there we go. No, I'm here. Thanks, Padma, and also thank you, Erica, for such a fascinating lecture and for all of your dedication to your data wrangling. I'm sure you're not the only super fan of LEPs. Also really lovely to hear about the comparisons between the US and the UK collectors from a historical perspective, because both countries also share the early entomologist John Abbott, who I'm quite familiar with here at the museum, because although he predates your research, many of his artworks are here in the collections here at the museum. And also, interestingly for our listeners and viewers, the only publication Abbott published was the natural history of the rarer Lepidopterist insects of Georgia, and its primary author was James Edward Smith, who, as some of us might know or not know, he was the founder of the Linnean Society. So there's a little fact to kick off the questions. I think before we head to the ones that have been posted in the question and answer section, thank you very much to everyone who has put some in there. I've got a quick one just to hear, or I'd like to hear a bit more about how you found working with the archives at the museum here, and how easy or not it might be to pinpoint analogue archival material that is relevant to your research, particularly as you mentioned that there are limitations in what data is available regarding collectors and their associated activities.
Sure. So, I mean, on sort of a macro scale, the correspondence for the entomology department is not cataloged at the item level. It's sort of alphabetical, and you get a box that's sort of all of the letters from someone with a surname that starts with A through F. So I showed up with a spreadsheet of names that I pulled from the database, basically, and I was just going through letters, looking to see if it was to or from someone on my spreadsheet, photographing the letter, and then moving on. So I was sort of really trying to crank through sort of as many letters as I possibly could, with the intention of sort of reading them later. But working with the archives is really interesting because it's something that I haven't gotten to do before. Because I have an MA in history, but I did it during COVID. So all of my research for that was online. So the NHM archive was the first time that I actually went and like looked at documents, like ever. Luckily, the sort of everyone who's in the archives is very nice. Put up with my sort of oodles of questions. And also we're willing to pull lots of stuff because again, it's largely uncatalogued. But yeah, I had a good time with it. Does that sort of answer your question? Like it was a challenge because there's so much stuff and it's largely not cataloged, but it was also fun because it was something I hadn't gotten to do before.
I think absolutely, and it's good that you did have a positive experience, and as you say, I mean that there is so much information available, and I think when you do get down to the analog records, especially those that aren't easy to catalogue, then it can be quite hard and a bit of a minefield as well to find that information. But moving away from analog records to digital, we have a question here from Ian Howarth who asks, so back in your slides, the timing of the fall in amateur collection rates looks to coincide more or less with the rise of the web. Do you think that it might be a coincidence?
Yes. So there is stuff in that US paper about the rise of observational databases. I didn't put that information in this just sort of on the basis of time, and I wanted to talk about more, but actually I do somewhere have. So this is observational records from SCAN starting from 1990 and going into 2018. So as you can tell, like observation records are taking off, where specimen record, like physical specimens, are sort of declining, shall we say. But yeah, one of the things that we commented on in that paper was sort of the rise of sites like iNaturalist, which you can post pictures to, which can sort of contribute to research. But isn't necessarily as useful as a specimen itself.
Brilliant, thank you. And then on to collections. So Gina Douglas, hello Gina. she asks, is it possible to estimate how many collections by true amateurs are lost when family either let those collections be destroyed, either intentionally or by neglect after the collector dies? I know you may not have that much experience in those types of collections.
Yeah,
thoughts.
It is something that came up quite often in the NHM archives, is sort of collections that they were aware of that they couldn't get, or that the family wanted like a lot of money for, that the NHM like couldn't justify or couldn't afford. There's some where they're well-known collectors and no one knows where their collections sort of ended up. So while I don't sort of have quantitative information about it, it's definitely something that shows up in the archives on sort of a semi-regular basis.
Thank you. And then a couple on digitization. So Sue McBean has asked, she appreciates some comments on the challenge to collecting insect specimens. So this is of any kind, not necessarily just Lepidoptera, in favor of use of photography, by which means identification can be determined in many cases, and hence distribution can be recorded without the death of an insect. So she has followed that up though by saying, talking about the ethical questions of, I suppose, collecting and I suppose in this day and age actually collecting any specimens and having to kill them, for want of a better term, in order to collect them.
Yeah, so one of sort of the problems with photographic information is that some insects really just can't be identified without sort of you turning it over and looking at sort of one surface versus another. So beetles are a good example of this. Differentiating between even sort of large groups of beetles comes down to how the hind legs articulate with the thorax, which can be hard to tell from a photo. There are sort of groups that have published like guidelines for ethical collecting of insects. So I know the Amateur Entomologists Society has sort of a full-on policy on sort of what is good collecting versus bad collecting. So sort of you should only take as much as you really need for whatever you're doing. Make sure that you have sort of permission from landowners, that sort of thing. So sort of balancing the ethics is absolutely sort of something that I know a lot of people are concerned with. But for insects, a lot of the times photographs are difficult as far as species level identifications in particular.
I think absolutely, and that also comes down to just the digitization process as well. And I think also, as you pointed out as well, sometimes there are so many different labels just for one specimen as well. I think it's
that one underwing moth with its like 9 labels.
Brilliant. I know I'm jumping around a little bit with the questions here, but just to keep the flow going as well, Marco has asked, which is a slightly more general question, why are moths and butterflies not pinned with their proboscis rolled out, since the proboscis length is often important when comparing floral tube length and potential Lepidopteran pollinator, for example, in orchids?
So I don't know that there's an answer to that. My assumption would be that it may, like having it extended would mean that it's very easy to break it off. So by rolling the proboscis underneath the head, underneath the body, it protects it, so it doesn't get broken. I have seen plenty of pictures of especially sphinx moths with their proboscis sort of fully extended while it's pinned. But sort of in general, I don't see it very often. And I assume it's sort of a don't damage the specimen, avoid specimen damage, but also sort of a space issue, because if you had that proboscis extended, that's going to take up more space in a drawer versus if it's rolled up. Absolutely.
I think everyone at the moment is at a shortage for space as well. So
yeah, museums are always at a shortage of space.
Yes. And societies as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another one from, let me see, Jamie Wildman. Hi, Erica. I use digitized label data to better understand how the checkered skipper was extirpated from England in 1976 for his PhD on the butterfly's reintroduction, which he submitted in October. Great job. I started with a data set of 266 existing English records, which label and archival data increased to over 3,800. I found that 21% of labels were attached to privately held specimens. Have you considered outreach to privately held collections to expand the data set?
So the short answer is no, and that is because I want sort of so much data that me having to go through all of the labels for multiple very large private collections would add just sort of so much time to my workflow. Also, because I'm sort of worried about institutions and not necessarily collecting generally, I really sort of am interested in the collectors who are contributing to large institutional collections. I haven't really thought about looking at private collections as much as sort of I would love to, and to get that data accessible. It's just sort of, it's not necessarily realistic for what I'm trying to do, if that makes sense. Though it's great that you managed that. Kudos.
Absolutely, and I think with that also you'd have to look for even more funding, even though you are obviously, as you were saying,
funding and time, the eternal sort of limits on all research.
Absolutely, and then even more support from, you know, all of the support that you have been, as you were saying, receiving to be able to do the work that you are able to do, which is phenomenal as well. Right, so we have a few more. One from Sarah Stewart. Hi Erica, do you think that the wider movement towards conservation has limited amateur collecting in favour of more formal regulated collection by professional researchers, e.g. with collecting permits? Also, Elizabeth Rollinson. Hi, Elizabeth. She's also brought in how far does the requirement now for permits to collect? So, example, Nagoya Protocol and other regulations account for the apparent fall in numbers of specimens collected.
So the permit thing is one of those things that's going to really sort of vary by country, and even in the states at the state level. So I know on some level, collecting in the UK has been so heavily regulated that it's hard to get permits or to go collecting on, in particular, like land that's owned by the National Trust and the Forestry Commission. In the States, it's quite a bit sort of less regulated. I know there was a paper or a chapter a while back about the role of amateurs in very specifically conservation research. And I know there are examples of amateurs who work pretty closely with professionals to do survey type work and to donate those specimens then to collections for things like conservation research. And that was sort of the most winding answer to a question ever. But sort of it boils down to things sort of vary a lot by country, and also sort of yes, but amateurs are also participating in conservation-y things.
Absolutely, and I think that obviously is an area where we do need to have increased interest and encouragement and support for amateurs to consider or to continue throughout the world, not just obviously in the UK and the US. So sticking with the question about collectors and professionals, one that isn't on the question answer but has been asked is, they're curious about the seeming correlation between the decline in amateur collectors and professionals. And it looks like just as the amateurs reached the bottom, professionals picked up. Is this because professionals are stopping the gap and they're just having to do it themselves?
The short answer is, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I gotta be honest with you. I don't really know. I haven't looked into that sort of why things are sort of switched when they do. I was doing sort of significantly more on the amateurs.
And then also just going back, I think then to the Lepidopterists themselves, Mark's asked, has declining lep populations impacted on this? And also when a species becomes rare or endangered, is it less likely to be collected, do you think?
So for the first answer, yes, especially in the UK. Because there's some pretty sort of well-documented examples of species going extinct in the United Kingdom, mostly due to habitat loss, but it would also mean that they're collected less. When things become sort of endangered or in danger of being endangered, A, they're sort of less likely to be collected, and B, a lot of the times collecting those sorts of species it's pretty heavily regulated. And you're really not supposed to sort of collect without a permit or without sort of someone saying, yes, that's okay.
Absolutely. And obviously incredibly important as well to ensure that populations are sustained and maintained into the future. Emily has said, thanks for your fantastic presentation. Lots of fantastic presentation. Thanks coming through for you. Emily's doing her PhD on the population of leps. She also says she loves this shortened name. I'm loving it as well, by the way, so I don't have to keep saying Lepidoptera.
So much easier.
Indeed. And she's doing her PhD in the UK. Do you think that museum specimens could be used to investigate the period that leps are active each year?
The short answer is yes, and people have done that. There are some papers with, I believe, UK specimens that went into looking at when butterflies were emerging year to year, and whether or not that's changing with global warming. Because as things get warmer earlier, butterflies and moths are more likely to emerge earlier. So yes, that people are doing the thing, or at least there has been 1 or 2 studies going through that.
Wonderful. And then just a couple more, I think. We've got 2 from Monica. In future, do you think that digital photographs will be enough to collect data instead of pinning? I think you have touched on this a little bit already, just because of the nature of pinning and the information that you need to glean from specimens. You can net a lep, call to reduce activity, then take pictures from multiple angles and then set the leps free. I don't even know if that might be possible without causing harm.
So there are some species of lep that you can absolutely sort of get them to species or pretty close to species from photographs. It's harder with moths because a lot of them have a tendency to be small and brown, and they might require things like genitalia dissections to identify the species. And especially with really small insects, it's hard to get a good enough sort of quality photo and enough quality photos to get things to species. Again, I'm going back to beetles because my former supervisor is a beetle person. That they often sort of require a beetle under a microscope in order to get things identified to species.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think that is all of the questions that we have, unless anyone did want to pop any more in there. But thank you so much for your lecture. It was a really lovely insight into the work that you've been doing and for your time today, but also your brilliant responses to all of those questions, which I do appreciate. Was incredibly wide spectrum.
We got good questions, which helps. So thanks everyone for your good questions.
Fantastic. So I think, I don't know if I hand back over to Padma now to wrap things up, but I think otherwise, thank you very much. Well, brilliant. So thank you to everyone for watching. I'm sure there will be many more lectures in the future if you are wanting to join the Linnean Society for those. And as I said earlier, if you did want any more information about the Linnean Society, its activities, events, then do just go online at linnean.org. But otherwise, thank you so much, Erica, for your time today. Really, really appreciated, and all the very best for your research in the future, and maybe see you again at the museum sometime soon.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.